Before we begin, we'd like to give special thanks to all of our sponsors for helping make this event possible each year. Specifically, thank you to CRL FormFox for being our title sponsor for 5 consecutive years. And thank you to our platinum sponsors, Orasure Technologies, Psychmedics, Samba Safety, UKG, and Quest Diagnostics.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for another session of Day with DISA. Today, we're joined by the FMCSA for a safety, regulatory, and clearinghouse update. We're joined by Bryan Price, Chief of the Drug and Alcohol Division at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, or the FMCSA, and Stacy Johnson, the Acting FMCSA Clearinghouse Program Manager. Bryan, Stacy, how are you guys doing today?
Great, thanks for having us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we appreciate you guys taking the time out of your very busy schedules to be here. Before we jump into that presentation, I do want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom right of the player. Any questions we're unable to answer today, we'll reach back out to you after Day with DISA. Additionally, we'll make a copy of this presentation available for download on the Materials tab after the session. With that being said, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of FMCSA, we'd like to thank DISA for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. Anytime we get an opportunity to communicate with stakeholders who are on the front lines out there, actually implementing drug and alcohol testing regulations and working with us to help keep our roads safe from impaired drivers, we certainly welcome that opportunity. So today, we're going to go through several things. We're going to give you an overview of our drug and alcohol clearinghouse, talk a little bit about the background of it, some of the common issues that users are experiencing when interacting and working with our clearinghouse. We'll touch a little bit on some of the statistics associated with the clearinghouse, what kind of data we're seeing in terms of users, what kind of drugs drivers are testing positive for. And then finally, we'll close things out with a few of the common questions that we hear from folks that are out there implementing the drug and alcohol testing regulations. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Stacy Johnson, and she'll jump into the heart of the presentation.
Thanks, Bryan. And I just wanted to welcome everybody here and just reiterate what Bryan said. We're happy to be here and be able to speak with everyone today. So we are going to start with a quick background and explanation of what the Clearinghouse is. The Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse is a secure online database containing CDL drivers' drug and alcohol program violation information. It gives employers, FMCSA, state driver licensing agencies, and state law enforcement personnel real-time information about CDL driver, drug, and alcohol prohibition information and violations. The Clearinghouse improves highway safety by making it more difficult for drivers to conceal their drug and alcohol program violations from current or prospective employers. Here's a brief history of how the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse came to be. It was mandated by Congress as part of MAP 21 legislation in July of 2012, because historically, drivers with drug and alcohol violations, such as positive tests and refusals, were able to disappear into the wind because there was no centralized repository for these violations. Most commonly, drivers with positive pre-employment tests could very easily move on to the next carrier without that carrier knowing that the driver had a violation in their past. At the time of the rulemaking, it is estimated that there were thousands of prohibited drivers on the road. FMCSA published the final rule on December 5th of 2016, which established the requirements for the clearinghouse and designated an implementation date of January 6th of 2020. The second clearinghouse rule, which was published on October 7th of 2021, requires that SDLAs, which are better known as state driver licensing agencies, must query the clearinghouse prior to issuing, renewing, transferring, or upgrading a CDL, or issuing, renewing, or upgrading a CLP, which is a commercial learner's permit. SDLAs must also be able to receive notifications from Clearinghouse of a driver's prohibited status and must downgrade or reinstate the driver's CDL or CDL privilege as needed. SDLAs must meet these requirements no later than November 18th of 2024. The Clearinghouse increases safety by providing real-time access to reported violation information. It makes it easier for employers to meet pre-employment investigation obligations and makes it more difficult for drivers to conceal drug and alcohol violations from employers. Which drivers are covered by the Clearinghouse? CDL drivers, which means any driver who holds a CDL and meets the requirements of the CDL standards in 49 CFR Part 383 and the FMCSA drug and alcohol testing program found in 49 CFR Part 382. The reference to CDL drivers does include CLP holders, which again is commercial learner's permit. For the purposes of this presentation, we use the term employers. Most employers are motor carriers or owner operators, but the term employers encompasses anyone who employs someone with a CDL or CLP. We also use the term consortia or third-party administrators or CTPAs, and that refers to organizations that employers designate to manage or conduct their drug and alcohol compliance programs. You may also hear these agencies referred to as service agents in our official rulemaking. Here is an overview of the actions that employers are responsible for completing in the Clearinghouse. During registration, you will link your Clearinghouse with your portal account if applicable. You will report CDL driver drug and alcohol program violations, including positive tests, test refusals, and actual knowledge. Conduct pre-employment and annual queries to check if a driver is prohibited from operating a CMV. We will obtain driver consent, which is required before a query can be conducted, and designate a CTPA if desired, and authorize the actions of that CTPA that they will complete on your behalf. The CTPA may be designated during registration or after you have completed your registration. Here is an overview of the actions that drivers are responsible for completing in the Clearinghouse. Drivers only need to register for the Clearinghouse to view their own violation history and to respond to query consent requests. If applicable, a driver also needs to be registered in order to designate a substance abuse professional. During registration, you may add or verify your CDL information. It is required to view violation history, respond to query consents from an employer or CTPA. Drivers must respond to an electronic consent request in the Clearinghouse for a full query from current or potential employers. This includes all pre-employment queries. Failure to provide consent to such requests does result in the driver being prohibited from performing safety-sensitive functions, including operating a CMV for that employer. And that is in accordance with 49 CFR 382 3C. This means that if you apply for a new job as a CDL driver, you will receive a consent request for a full query, and you need to respond to that consent request in order to be hired to operate that CMV. If you do not plan on changing employers, you may still need to register for the clearinghouse if your employer chooses to conduct a full query to access your clearinghouse record. Here is an overview of the actions that MROs and SAPs are responsible for completing in the clearinghouse. MROs must register and self-certify that they meet the MRO qualifications per 49 CFR 40.121. They also report positive, adulterated, or substituted drug tests or test refusals per 40.191. SAPs must register and self-certify that they meet all of the SAP qualifications per 40.281. SAPs will also enter certain information about a driver's return to duty process, including the date of the initial SAP assessment and the date that the SAP determines that the driver is eligible for return to duty testing. Before you can enter any return to duty information about a driver, you do need to approve the driver's request in the clearinghouse to become their designated substance abuse professional. We're now going to look at some of the common issues that users have encountered. We recommend that users do not select backup codes as an option for an authentication method, as they can only be used a limited number of times. This is meant really to be a fallback in case none of the other methods, such as a phone call or text message, works for you. They are considered to be the least secure option by login.gov. The backup code creates 10 codes that can only be used one time. If you have used 9 of these codes, you really need to generate a new set before using the last code, or you will be locked out of your login.gov account. If the user chooses the backup code option, but is unable to provide the backup code, the user needs to then delete their login.gov account, and it does require a 24-hour waiting period before creating that new login.gov account. If you do need to delete your login.gov account and experience any difficulty logging into the clearinghouse with your new login.gov, we suggest that you send an email to clearinghouse@dot.gov for assistance. So here's some common issues with registration and employers. If an employer mistakenly registers as a CTPA, they must contact FMCSA to delete their account and then re-register with the correct role. If an employer registered as an assistant rather than an admin, the employer would upgrade their role in their portal account to DAC, Motor Carrier Admin. If the employer is not linked to portal, the current employer admin does have the ability to upgrade the user from assistant to admin from their clearinghouse dashboard. If an employer is registered as a driver, but is only an employer, they must contact FMCSA to delete that account and then register with the correct role. If the employer is both an employer and a driver, the user can log into their driver account and then link to their portal, which will give them the option of both roles. If the employer is not linked to portal, they must contact FMCSA, who will delete their account and then register with the correct role. An employer can also log into an employer account and add their CDL information, which would give them both roles, employer and driver, and that is used for any type of owner-operator. When an employer is reporting violations, the driver's social security number cannot be used. The employer must enter the driver's name, date of birth, CDL number, and state of issuance. Please remember to remove all spaces and hyphens when entering the CDL number. The information is verified against FMCSA systems. The employer has 2 attempts to enter the correct information. After the second attempt, the violation will be reported, but it is flagged for FMCSA to review. Common issues associated with queries include not having any queries available on the query plan and entering the CDL information incorrectly. So we just have some reminders for you, and that does include removing any spaces and hyphens from the CDL number, including all leading zeros, entering the correct date of birth. If it is a Mexican license, you will be entering MX for both the country code and the state. Allow the issuing state 10 business days to update the record if there has been a transfer. Ensure the CDL is not expired. Ensure that the driver has not obtained a CDL in a different state. And ensure that the driver does actually possess a CLP or CDL. When initiating bulk queries, please do not include any middle name. Do not include suffixes, including senior, junior, first, or second. Ensure the date of birth was entered in the correct format, and we have a 2-day month, a 2-day year, and a 2-day month, 2-digit day, and a 4-digit year. And then remove any extra spaces before and after the text in the data fields. And then just ensure that the country codes are correct before submitting. If a driver is registered incorrectly as the employer, they do need to contact FMCSA to have their account deleted, and they will need to go ahead and re-register. If the driver is both the driver and employer, they are going to go ahead and add their CDL information to the employer account, and it doesn't need to be deleted at that point. And then the same rules will apply here. If a driver does have trouble validating their CDLs, we want to remind the driver to remove any spaces and hyphens from the CDL number, include any of the leading zeros, entering the correct date of birth. For Mexican licenses, we're using the MX for both country and state codes, and allowing 10 business days for the SDLA to update the driver's record if it is a new CDL or transferred from another state. If a driver is having trouble providing consent, we do remind them to ensure that their CDL was validated and ensure with the employer that that query request was submitted. So moving on to common issues concerning violations. If a driver cannot view any of their violation information, we first ask that they go ahead and verify with the MRO or employer that the violation was reported to the clearinghouse. The next step would be for the driver to enter and validate their CDL information. When a driver is unable to designate their SAP, we want to ensure that the violation was actually reported. Verify that the driver entered and validated their CDL information. Ensure that the SAP is registered with the clearinghouse, and ensure that the driver is entering the SAP's name correctly. If a SAP cannot view the driver and their list on their dashboard, we want to ensure that the driver is registered in the clearinghouse and that they have designated the correct SAP. And Bryan, I'm going to throw it over to you for the next section.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. What I'm going to do now is jump into some of the statistics and data that we're seeing associated with the clearinghouse. First and foremost, I'd like to remind everyone that through this link that you see on the slide here, individuals can go in on a monthly basis and look at updates of the data. Just for starters here, one of the things we wanted to point out is how many different users under the various roles that we have registered in the clearinghouse. You can see here we have over 3 million drivers, approaching 500,000 employers registered in the clearinghouse. And then you can see on down the list here, there are over 2,000 medical review officers registered in the clearinghouse, over 4,000 substance abuse professionals. As Stacy mentioned, one of the main features of the clearinghouse, or regulatory requirements, if you will, is that employers, when they're hiring a driver, and then at least once a year for their entire driver roster, check the clearinghouse to make sure a driver doesn't have drug and alcohol violations and a prohibition from operating. Since implementation of the clearinghouse in January of 2020, we've had over 4.6 million unique CDL holders queried. From the data here, you can see an uptick each year. Calendar year 2022, we don't have December data included here yet, and that's always a big month for us as employers are doing their annual queries. So the bottom line here is we're seeing an upward trend in the number of unique CDL holders that are queried each year. What kind of drug violation data are we seeing? You can see here, this is for calendar years 20 through 22 up to January. You can see here an upward tick each year in the number of violations that have been reported to the clearinghouse, almost 65,000 in 2022. And again, that doesn't include the full month of December yet. Couple of things here. One thing is that I caution folks that this doesn't necessarily mean we're seeing an uptick in the positive rate. The clearinghouse doesn't collect the number of tests conducted. We only get violations. So just from this data, we can't necessarily say that the percentage of drivers tested is having positive results is going up. But we can, from this data, see that the number of violations reported to the clearinghouse is going up. Another thing I'll point out from looking at this data, I know it's kind of hard to read on the screen probably, but if you look at the 2022 bar there for the drug violations reported to the clearinghouse, right at 55,000 of the just over 64,000 violations are positive test results. But the thing that jumps out to me, which we try to get the word out on this a lot, is we've got almost 9,000 drug test refusals reported to the clearinghouse. One of the things we see a lot is, guys are notified for a random test, and they might say, oh, well, I've got another job lined up over here at a different company. I'm just not going to go in for that test. They really need to understand the consequences of that are a refusal reported to the clearinghouse, and it basically counts the same as a positive test result. So that's one thing with the driver community. We're trying to make sure they really understand that failing to report for a drug test is going to end up having the same consequences as a positive test. This is just the same data for alcohol violations. The numbers here, as you might expect, pale in comparison to the number of drug test violations that are reported to the clearinghouse. But this just gives you a sense of how many alcohol violations have been reported to the clearinghouse by calendar year. Now, a real common question that folks have is like, okay, we know you've got these thousands of positive drug tests reported to the clearinghouse. What are drivers testing positive for? Again, this is just summary data here of the different substances that have been identified in positive drug tests reported to the clearinghouse. As as most folks might expect, you can see here that marijuana is the most common substance identified. It's running at just under 60% of the positive tests that are reported to the clearinghouse include marijuana. But if you do the math, that means that almost 4 in 10 of the positive drug tests that are reported to FMCSA's clearinghouse include substances other than marijuana. And if you look really closely at this data, one of the things that jumped out to me when I came into this job is that just about 1 out of 3 of the drug tests with positive results that are reported to FMCSA's clearinghouse contain either cocaine, methamphetamine, or amphetamine. Clearly, all of these are prohibited substances, but when you got 1 out of 3 of the positive tests reported to the clearinghouse, including cocaine, meth, and amphetamines, we can all agree that those are substances that we don't want anyone on the road using. Another question we get a lot is, well, how many drivers are currently in a prohibited status? How many unique drivers have had a violation reported to the clearinghouse? You can see here, since implementation of the clearinghouse, we're approaching 162,000 different drivers have had a violation reported to FMCSA's clearinghouse, which puts them into a prohibited status. If you look down there at the green row, over 44,000 of those drivers have gone through the return to duty process, have seen a substance abuse professional, have been cleared for a return to duty test, and have tested negative, so they're no longer prohibited. As of the 1st of December, we've got just over 117,000 drivers that are in a prohibited status. Again, meaning they've had a violation reported to the clearinghouse, and they're not allowed to operate commercial motor vehicles. One thing that jumps out to us, and we don't know the reason behind this, but of that 117,000 prohibited drivers, 3 out of 4 of them, or basically 75%, 89,229, have not started the return to duty process, meaning they haven't even designated a substance abuse professional within the clearinghouse. So obviously they remain in a prohibited status. Okay, so what we're going to do now is jump into some of the common questions and answers. Stacy and I are going to alternate these, so I will turn the first one over to Stacy.
Thanks, Brian. So we just wanted to remind everybody about the CBD notice that was issued by ODAPSI. And basically, it is a notice that does confirm that we will not accept CBD as an excuse for a positive THC. The labeling of many CBD products are misleading because the products can contain higher levels of THC than what the product states. The CBD use is not a legitimate medical explanation, and medical review officers cannot and will not verify a drug test confirmed negative if you use CBD products. So we do say buyer beware. Please be careful on what you're purchasing, because we have seen instances where drivers have taken the product after a positive THC, had it tested at a private lab, and has seen for themselves that the amount of THC that was on the label was not indicative of how much THC came up on their own laboratory result.
Okay, kind of in that same vein, another issue we see a lot is the question about medical marijuana. And like CBD, ODAPSI has also published a medical marijuana notice on their website. And the bottom line is that marijuana remains a prohibited substance, and a prescription for marijuana cannot be used as a justification to overturn a positive drug test. We also caution folks about recreational marijuana. It's obviously legalized in a lot of states, If you're going to drive a truck under Department of Transportation rules, it remains a prohibited substance. Same goes for our friends in Canada. Marijuana has been legalized largely on a recreational basis across Canada. We always caution our Canadian folks that if you're going to operate commercial vehicles in the United States, you're still subject to our drug and alcohol testing regulations. That still includes marijuana, and marijuana remains a prohibited substance.
Okay, so one of the other frequently asked questions that we receive is whether FMCSA can remove a positive drug test violation from the clearinghouse based on a prescription from a driver. And the answer to that is no. So the MRO is the only individual that can request the removal of that violation from the clearinghouse if they determine that there is a valid medical explanation for that positive test result. So when a MRO is verifying test results, they do call the driver and they do a positive, an interview for any non-negative test results. So it's really imperative that the drivers answer the phone, have that conversation with the MRO, and provide that prescription to them at that point. The MRO does have a process where they will go ahead and verify the prescription, and they may ask to speak to the prescribing doctor, but that does have to go through the MRO, and FMCSA does not play any type of role in that entire process. So we do receive, a lot of petitions where drivers would like, violations removed based on a prescription that they have, and we do send them back to the MRO. So in order to streamline the process, we do recommend that, again, drivers answer the phone call or return the phone call of the MROs and go ahead and work that process with their MRO regarding any prescriptions.
Okay, another common issue we encounter, and this may be more common than you might expect, but we refer to it as the shy bladder process, where a CDL driver goes in and can't give enough urine within 3 hours. So we just try to get the word out that there is a shy bladder process under the regulations. The driver has up to 5 days to get evaluated by a licensed physician that can justify the reason for the failure to provide an adequate urine sample. The MRO in these cases has to receive a copy of the evaluation and the medical records and can either cancel or declare the test a refusal. But the bottom line is the regulations associated with this shy bladder process are laid out in 49 CFR 4193 and 4195. So again, we just try to get the word out, especially to collection facilities, employers, and drivers that may be having this issue, that there is a process under the regulations to address this.
So another question that comes to us has to do with other DOT modes and whether an employer should report to the clearinghouse the results of any tests completed under the authority of another DOT agency. So we're talking about FAA, FRA, FTA, which, federal aviation, federal rail, federal transit, Coast Guard. So those tests and those violations are not and cannot be reported to the clearinghouse. So only tests that are conducted on the authority of FMCSA and what we would consider Part 382 tests and Part 382 violations may be reported to the clearinghouse. They must be done on a federal CCF, and on that CCF, they would check the box that says FMCSA. One of the other things is these tests should only be conducted on CDL drivers, or CLP holders. So if you have a driver that does not have a CLP or does not have a CDL, they should not be they should not have a test conducted on a federal CCF, and FMCSA should not be the testing authority for that test.
Okay, before FMCSA established the clearinghouse, there was a long-standing provision in our regulations under Part 391 that prospective employers check a 3-year history of a driver's potential drug and alcohol violations with prior employers. With implementation of the clearinghouse, now that it's been in place for 3 full years, there's a provision in our regulation that as of January 6th of 2023, when an employer is doing that drug and alcohol background check on a driver, they must check the clearinghouse now that we have 3 years of violation data in the clearinghouse. The manual checks that were previously done are no longer required. Now, a common question we've been getting is, well, can motor carriers, if they feel more comfortable, continue to also do the manual background checks? In other words, contacting the prior employers in addition to doing the required clearinghouse check? The answer to that is yes. An employer can, if they so choose, contact prior employers manually as they have in the past. However, in doing so, we just ask that the employers doing that are clear that it is no longer a requirement under the federal motor carrier safety regulations to do the manual background checks for drug and alcohol violations. So they can do that. They just are doing it under their own authority, and that and any responses are also voluntary on the part of the receiving motor carrier. Okay, so that's what we had in the way of prepared questions. We've got a couple of different resources here on phone numbers for individuals that are interested in more information about the clearinghouse or our drug and alcohol programs in general. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for their attention. And again, we appreciate the opportunity provided by DISA to speak to everyone today. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Bryan, we've got a couple submitted questions. I know we only have you for a couple more minutes. Let's power through a couple quick questions. If I have a driver go in for pre-employment and the MRO needs a second test, but the driver has already accepted a different job, do they still need to complete that second test?
I'll take that question. The answer is yes. So that second test that the MRO is asking for is considered a continuation of that first test. So if the MRO comes back and the first specimen is, invalid, and the MRO says we need a second test under direct observation, whether or not that driver accepted a position with another job, they are required to submit that second specimen as a continuation of that first collection. So failure to do so is considered a refusal.
Gotcha. Are there plans to add hair or oral fluid testing as an option?
Okay, I can take that one. As you know, under DOT regulations today, urine testing is the only approved method. However, there's been a lot of talk, as I'm sure your folks are aware, that hair testing and oral fluid is being considered. Right now, oral fluid is on a faster track because the Department of Health and Human Services has established testing protocols for oral fluid, and the Department of Transportation has published a proposed rule to use oral fluids. So right now, be on the lookout for a potential final rule regarding oral fluids. That's part of the department's regulatory agenda. Hair testing, again, we're dependent on the Department of Health and Human Services. And as of now, the Department of Health and Human Services has not established procedures for the use of hair testing in DOT programs.
Okay, great. Do I need to run queries if I use a TPA?
So the answer to that is yes. So as an employer, you may designate a CTPA for different tasks, and that's querying, reporting violations, or reporting return to duty. So the first step of that would be ensuring that you have given your TPA, that you've requested your TPA and they've accepted your designation. then ensuring that you have given them the proper permissions within Clearinghouse to complete those tasks for you. But I think the biggest piece of the puzzle is ensuring that you have that talk with your TPA to ensure that you do want them to complete those actions for you, because a lot of times we hear, well, I thought my TPA was doing it, and your TPA is not doing it. So you just want to have that clear conversation, whether it's part of your contract or not. That's a business decision with you and your TPA, but ensure that you're both on the same page, so you know that they are being completed by them, because in the end, the responsibility falls on the motor carrier.
Absolutely. Can an employee who tested positive use a non-US based SAP?
The answer to that is yes. Obviously, we have Canadian and Mexican employers and Canadian and Mexican licensed drivers that operate in the United States. And under Part 40, MROs and SAPs for Mexico and Canada can play a part in our drug and alcohol testing regulations.
Okay, perfect. Can I enter a drug and alcohol program violation for a CDL driver if they are not registered for the clearinghouse?
Okay, I can take that one. Yes, you can. That's the simple answer. A driver does not need to be registered because the violation is based on a driver's CDL number. So the employer is just going to enter that information, and registration is not necessary.
Okay. Is a social required to enter a driver violation in the clearinghouse?
The answer to that is no. So a motor carrier is entering the driver's first and last name, date of birth, the CDL number, along with the state of issuance and country of issuance. So a social security number is never entered into the system at all.
Gotcha. And then one last question. You guys have been extremely generous with your time. It's very appreciated. But if we were unable to answer your specific question, keep an eye out over the next couple of days. We'll be collecting all the extra questions that we received up, getting with Bryan and Stacy to get answers and providing those back out to everyone. But the last question, are there plans to add fentanyl to testing panels?
Okay, yeah, good question. Obviously, fentanyl's in the news a lot in the United States. Again, we're bound by the Department of Health and Human Services and what drugs they say are to be tested for. But the Department of Health and Human Services, as we understand it, is considering adding fentanyl to the panel of drugs to be tested for, but not yet. It's just under consideration.
Great. Bryan, Stacy, thank you so much for spending a little bit of your time with us today. And we appreciate everyone who joined for this session. Hope to see you in the next couple.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.